But the fact that we've got a 3-year-old child that obviously died and was cremated and was buried, this is something that is just giving us some insight into the behavior of these.
In 1949, archaeologists found a tiny child's tooth inside an Alaskan cave. They boxed it up, shipped it to a museum, and forgot about it. For nearly 70 years, the tooth sat forgotten inside a museum drawer in Copenhagen. Nobody realized it belonged to an entire human population that history had completely missed. When scientists finally looked inside it, one of the oldest stories ever told about America began to fall apart. The 67-year sleep in Copenhagen. Our story begins in the summer of 1949 on the cold, windy landscape of northwestern Alaska. A Danish archaeologist named Helge Larsen was exploring a remote area when he climbed up into a series of limestone caves. He spent weeks excavating the frozen dirt floors, pulling out thousands of ancient animal bones and stone tools. Among this massive collection, he found something very small and easily missed: a single worn-down tooth belonging to a child roughly 1.5 years old. Larsen packed the tooth along with the rest of his finds and sent them to the Danish National Museum in Copenhagen. Once the crates arrived, the collection was catalogued and stored away, and the tooth stayed in the museum's archives for nearly 7 decades. Now, Larsen did not overlook it because he was careless. He simply did not have the tools required to analyze it. In 1949, radiocarbon testing was in its earliest stages, and the entire science of pulling ancient DNA out of fossils had not yet been invented. That tooth had no choice but to wait for the future to catch up with it. The breakthrough finally happened in 2016. An archaeologist named Jeff Rasick, working with the National Park Service, was reviewing the old Alaskan collections in Copenhagen when he came across the tooth again. He realized that modern genetic sequencing could pull information out of this specimen that Larsen never could have accessed in 1949. Rasick teamed up with researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and a group of international genetic specialists to see whether any usable biological material had survived inside it. When scientists finally sampled and sequenced the interior of the tooth, the results were nothing like what anyone expected. The data showed that this child carried an extremely old genetic signature, one connected to a population of people that had a genetic signature unlike any population previously identified. This one small child, it turned out, belonged to a chapter of human history that had been completely erased from modern memory. But to figure out who these people actually were, we first need to understand the strange lost world this child grew up in. The edge of a drowned continent. The cave where Larsen found that tooth is located on the Seward Peninsula, on the western edge of mainland Alaska. On a clear day, you can stand on the high bluffs of this peninsula and look out across the water toward the Diomede Islands and past them all the way to the coast of Russia. Today, a stretch of cold, rough ocean called the Bering Strait separates the two continents, spanning about 53 miles at its narrowest point. For a very long time, school textbooks taught a very specific story about this stretch of water. They usually showed a map with a single arrow pointing from Asia into America, calling it the Bering Land Bridge. When you hear that name, the picture that possibly comes to mind is a narrow, icy walkway that freezing, desperate hunters ran across as fast as they could while chasing animals. But modern science has shown that this picture is completely off. It was never a temporary bridge at all. It was a massive and stable stretch of land roughly the size of Australia. Scientists call this lost world Beringia. Global sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet during the peak of the Ice Age because so much of the planet's water was locked up in continental ice sheets, and that drop exposed the shallow ocean floor between Siberia and Alaska. Instead of a frozen wasteland, Beringia was a highly livable grassland ecosystem that scientists refer to as the Mammoth Steppe. This landscape supported enormous herds of grazing animals, including woolly mammoths and wild horses, along with countless smaller plants and creatures that depended on that same ecosystem to survive. People living there had steady access to large herds of grazing animals, fresh water from mountain glaciers, and plenty of stone for making tools and weapons. Today, nearly all of that ancient land is buried under silt and salt water, turning it into a kind of phantom country nobody can walk through anymore. As the great ice sheets melted at the end of the Ice Age, sea levels rose quickly and swallowed up valleys, rivers, and old hunting camps that had stood for generations. The water crept in slowly over hundreds of years, turning peninsula tips into isolated islands and pushing populations back toward higher ground. The Trail Creek Caves sit high on a limestone ridge overlooking what was once the eastern frontier of that vast territory. The people who used those caves were not travelers passing through on their way to somewhere new. They were already settled there and had no reason to think that would ever change. Inside Trail Creek Caves. To understand what daily life looked like in this environment, you have to look closely at the layout of the Trail Creek Caves themselves. There are 12 distinct cave openings cut into limestone hills high above a body of water called the Imaruk Basin. Because the ground in this part of Alaska stays frozen year-round as permafrost, the inside of these caves works almost like a natural freezer, which is exactly why so much organic material managed to survive instead of breaking down within a few years. When archaeologists analyzed the thousands of bone fragments recovered from the cave floors, they found a detailed record of Ice Age life. The permafrost had preserved the remains of ancient bison and caribou, and many of the bones carried distinct impact marks and fractures left by stone tools, showing the cave's occupants butchered the animals there. The interior of the caves offered real shelter from the brutal winds sweeping across the open plains, giving families a safe place to rest, live, repair their weapons, and share food after a hunt. Mixed in with the animal bones were the specialized tools people relied on to bring those animals down in the first place. Layers of dirt showed that these caves served double duty, as a hunting lookout during the warmer months and a safe shelter during fierce Arctic storms. The tool collection included tiny razor-sharp stone flakes called microblades, inserted into spear points, dart points, knives, and composite cutting tools carved from antler, creating weapons capable of tearing through the thick hide of a large animal. For years, researchers argued about exactly how old human activity at this site really was, with some of the earliest tests suggesting dates stretching back as far as 15,000 years. To settle the debate, later researchers applied more advanced radiocarbon methods directly to the most diagnostic artifacts in the collection. They managed to precisely date a specific set of slotted antler projectile points recovered from the caves, and those tests placed them at roughly 11,300 years old. That timing puts human activity at Trail Creek right in the middle of a major environmental shift, right as the Ice Age was drawing to a close, and the land bridge itself was beginning to vanish beneath rising water. The Fortress of Dogma. For nearly the entire 20th century, mainstream archaeology refused to accept that anyone could have been in the Americas before about 13,000 years ago. Academic experts fiercely defended a single dominant theory known as the Clovis First Model, named after a site near Clovis, New Mexico, where researchers in 1932 uncovered beautifully made stone spear points with a distinctive fluted base. Once radiocarbon dating became available in the 50s, tests showed that these Clovis spear points were roughly 13,000 years old, and almost overnight, a simple story took hold in classrooms everywhere. The theory claimed that around 13,000 years ago, one group of big game hunters crossed over from Siberia, found a narrow path through the melting Canadian glaciers, and spread across North and South America in just a few hundred years. It was a tidy story that fit perfectly onto a single textbook page. That simplicity made it incredibly appealing to educators and historians alike. It offered them a clear timeline where one group of pioneers settled an entire empty hemisphere in what amounted to the blink of an eye. The fluted Clovis point became a kind of symbol for the beginning of American history itself, and for generations, students learned that these specific tools marked the absolute starting line for human presence in the Western Hemisphere. But this model was not held together by evidence alone. It was also enforced through real professional pressure. For decades, the Clovis First idea functioned almost like a fortress inside academia. Archaeologists who reported sites that looked older than 13,000 years often ran into immediate skepticism, and not the friendly kind. Researchers frequently saw their funding threatened and their methods picked apart at conferences before their data had even been fully reviewed. That kind of gatekeeping created a sense of caution across the field. Graduate students learned early on that securing a job or getting a dissertation approved usually meant sticking close to the accepted timeline. Promising sites were sometimes left unexcavated or underreported, because defending a pre-Clovis date could damage a career before it had really started. The consensus became something closer to a professional identity than a scientific theory, and for a long time, the matter was treated as settled. The cracks in the ice. Despite all that institutional pressure, real physical evidence kept turning up in places it was never supposed to exist, and the old fortress slowly began to crack. The first major blow came from the opposite end of the hemisphere, deep in South America. An archaeologist named Tom Dillehay spent years excavating a site called Monte Verde in southern Chile, where he uncovered clear evidence of human huts, wooden tools, and even scraps of wild potato that reliably dated back 14,500 years. An established settlement at the southern tip of South America at that age simply did not fit within the Clovis first model. If people had only reached Alaska 13,000 years ago, there was no realistic way they could have crossed thousands of miles of rugged terrain, built working communities, and settled into Chile 1,500 years before they had even arrived in the north. The discovery set off a furious academic debate. Defenders of the old model traveled down to Chile to inspect the site themselves, combing through every layer of dirt and questioning every method Dillehay had used to date it. But the evidence held up every time. Humans had clearly been living near the southern tip of South America more than 1,000 years before Clovis culture ever took shape farther north. The vindication of Monte Verde opened the door for other researchers who had been sitting on data that did not fit the old story. Old excavation files were reopened across the Americas, and new projects launched with a freedom to dig deeper than before. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania produced a long, well-preserved sequence of stone tools and fire pits that pushed the eastern timeline back significantly, showing continuous human use of the site stretching back thousands of years earlier than expected. There was also the Buttermilk Creek site in Texas, where archaeologists dug directly beneath the official Clovis layer and found thousands of older stone tools dating back roughly 15,500 years. That discovery hit especially hard, since it happened in the exact region where Clovis culture supposedly began in the first place. Finding a separate, older toolkit sitting right underneath it left little room for doubt that people had already built a working life on that land long before the first Clovis point was ever made. The physical evidence had become overwhelming, and even the field's most stubborn defenders had to admit the old timeline was broken. But while archaeologists spent decades arguing over stone tools and dirt layers, the final blow to the traditional story did not come from a shovel, but from a genetic blueprint buried in the bones of two infants, the children of the Tanana Valley. The true genetic breakthrough came from a site deep in the interior of Alaska, far from the coastal caves. In 2006, Ben Potter, an archaeologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, identified an ancient campsite in the Tanana River Valley that came to be known as Upward Sun River, or Zaasa Na in the language of the Middle Tanana people. Potter's team returned to the site year after year, and in 2010, they uncovered the cremated remains of a 3-year-old child in one layer of the site. Then, in 2013, digging into a layer just beneath that cremation, they found something even more remarkable, an undisturbed burial pit holding the remains of 2 infant girls. The details of that burial say a lot about how these children were cared for, both in life and in the way their community said goodbye to them. Both infants had been covered in red ochre, which is a bright mineral pigment used in sacred burial ceremonies by ancient people across the world, and they were buried together, along with real grave goods, including 4 decorated antler rods, 2 stone dart points, and several stone bifaces that had likely formed part of a hunting weapon. Genetic testing later suggested the 2 infants were closely related, possibly first cousins. The local indigenous community eventually gave them names of their own, Zakiti Anan Teidegai, meaning sunrise child girl, and Yokanan Teidegai, meaning dawn twilight child girl. The older of the two, referred to by scientists as USR1, had been somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks old when she died, while the younger infant had not survived past 30 weeks of development. Because the bone material was so well preserved, samples were sent to an international team of geneticists, including researchers at the University of Copenhagen led by Eske Willerslev. Scientists extracted ancient DNA from the dense petrous bone of the skull, which tends to preserve genetic material far better than almost any other part of the human skeleton. From USR1, they managed to recover a complete high-quality genome. The team published their findings in the journal Nature in January 2018, and the results changed the entire conversation around how humans first reached the Americas. Potter's team also found something else at the site worth mentioning. Evidence at Upward Sun River pointed to some of the earliest known use of salmon anywhere in the New World, suggesting these people relied on more than just big game to survive the long stretches between hunts. The people connected to this site are associated with what archaeologists call the Denali complex, a broader culture that lived across interior Alaska, the Yukon, and northern British Columbia from roughly 12,500 to 6,000 years ago. The ghost population revealed. When geneticists finished reading USR1's DNA, they realized they were looking at something nobody had expected. Her genetic code did not match modern Native American populations, and it did not match ancient Siberian populations either. Instead, it belonged to an entirely separate, parallel branch of the human family tree that no one had known existed until that moment. Willerslev and his colleagues worked out a rough timeline for how this split might have happened. Their modeling suggested that a founding population began separating from groups in Asia somewhere around 34,000 years ago, though genetic exchange between the two groups appears to have continued until roughly 25,000 years ago, by which point this population may already have been settled in Alaska. From there, the lineage that would become the ancient Beringians split away from the ancestors of nearly all other Native Americans, with researchers placing that particular split somewhere between 18,100 and 22,000 years ago. Scientists gave this newly identified group a name of their own, the ancient Beringians. In genetics, a population like this gets called a ghost population, a term used for a distinct group of people who lived successfully for thousands of years and then eventually disappeared without leaving any clear, distinct surviving lineage in the modern world. These people were not some failed offshoot of history. They raised families, hunted large game, fished salmon out of Alaskan rivers, and survived some of the harshest conditions our species has ever faced, generation after generation. Their entire story now survives mostly through the chemistry locked inside old bone and enamel. Right here is where our story circles back to that single tooth sitting in a Copenhagen drawer. When researchers sequenced the DNA from the roughly 9,000-year-old Trail Creek tooth that Larson had found back in 1949, they compared it directly against USR1's genome from the Tanana Valley. The results matched. The child from the coastal cave and the infants from the interior valley belonged to the exact same ancient Beringian population, even though the two sites sit more than 700 kilometers apart. That match happened to be very important to researchers. It proved the ghost population was never a small, isolated family group that died out in a single valley somewhere. This was a real, widespread population that held on to its own distinct genetic identity across a huge stretch of land and time, surviving major environmental changes along the way. Based on later archaeological evidence, it appears that ancestors of present-day Athabascan-speaking peoples expanded north sometime around 6,000 years ago, eventually absorbing or replacing what remained of the ancient Beringian population in the region. The Beringian standstill. The existence of this ghost population lined up perfectly with a theory known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. This idea, which was developed by researchers including John Hoffaker, suggested that the ancestors of Native Americans did not simply pass through Alaska on their way south. Instead, they became geographically isolated in Beringia for an extremely long stretch of time. The geography of the Ice Age explains why this pause happened at all. To the west, Siberia had turned into a cold, dry landscape, making sustained movement between Siberia and Beringia much more difficult. To the east, the enormous Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets formed a wall of solid ice reaching miles into the sky, completely blocking any path forward into the rest of North America. People were effectively boxed in at the top of the world, caught between two barriers they had no way of crossing. Modern genetic data suggests this isolation lasted for thousands of years, with many researchers citing an estimate of up to 8,000 years. To put that number in perspective, 8,000 years is longer than the entire span of written human history. Entire generations were born, grew old, and died on this now vanished stretch of land without ever once seeing the territory that lay south of the ice. The Kelp Highway. For thousands of years, the ancestors of Native Americans were completely trapped. As we just stated, they were stuck in an environmental box at the top of the world, pinned down by a large wall of solid ice that rose miles into the sky. But around 16,000 years ago, the climate of the planet finally began to change. The world was warming up, and the icy fortress that kept humans out of the Americas began to crack. But the way these people escaped their long isolation was surprisingly not by walking. Instead, they took to the water. For nearly a century, older textbooks claimed that the first Americans waited until the glaciers over Canada melted down the middle, opening a narrow land path called the Ice-Free Corridor. The story went that hunters followed mammoths down this dusty valley on foot. But modern geology has completely shattered that timeline. We now know that this inland corridor was a freezing, muddy wasteland that could not support human life until much later. So, how did humans get past the ice? The answer is found along the rugged Pacific coast. While the interior of the continent remained a frozen labyrinth, the edges of the glaciers touching the ocean began to melt and retreat. This opened up a watery path along the coastline. The people of Beringia were more than just land hunters, but also highly skilled mariners. They likely used sturdy, skin-covered boats capable of navigating the rough waters of the North Pacific. By hugging the shore, they could bypass the towering ice sheets entirely, sailing right past the barriers that had blocked their ancestors for millennia. As they traveled south, they followed a highly productive marine ecosystem that scientists call the Kelp Highway. A huge, continuous forest of giant kelp stretched all the way from Japan, up around the coast of Beringia, and down the entire western edge of the Americas. This underwater highway changed everything for the travelers. The thick kelp forests acted as natural wave breakers that calmed the rough coastal waters and made boat travel much safer. More importantly, these kelp forests were teeming with life, which provided a non-stop buffet. The travelers had access to an endless supply of fish, abalone, crabs, sea urchins, and sea otters. Because this marine environment was virtually identical all the way down the coast, the travelers did not have to constantly invent new tools or adapt to strange new land environments. As long as they stayed on the water and followed the kelp, the menu stayed exactly the same. This coastal route explains how humans managed to spread from Alaska all the way to the southern tip of South America in a remarkably short amount of time. But it also introduces a frustrating mystery for modern archaeologists. If thousands of people traveled along this coastline, why is it so hard to find their campsites? The answer is that the melting glaciers caused global sea levels to rise by hundreds of feet. The caves they slept in and the fires they lit are now completely underwater, buried under silt at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The plot thickens. Population Y. In 2015, an international research team led by geneticist Pontus Skoglund, working alongside senior researchers, including David Reich, analyzed the DNA of several indigenous groups living deep in the Amazon rainforest of South America. What they found inside that DNA had no obvious explanation. Using advanced statistical models built to trace deep human ancestry, the team processed genetic markers from groups including the Surui and Caritiana peoples of Brazil and flagged an anomaly nobody had predicted. Buried inside their DNA was a distinct genetic connection to ancient populations from Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands, places separated from the Amazon by an enormous stretch of ocean. Researchers ended up naming this mysterious genetic contributor Population Y. The strangest part of the discovery is that this specific Australasian signal is almost completely missing from Native American populations across North America. And that absence creates a real puzzle. If the ancestors of these Amazonian groups had simply walked down through Alaska like everyone else supposedly did, you would expect to find traces of that same signal scattered somewhere along the route through North America. Instead, the signal shows up almost exclusively deep in certain pockets of the Amazon, as though it slipped in through some entirely different path that nobody has managed to fully map out yet. This finding directly contradicts the old one-wave migration model that Clovis first had been built around. It suggests there was a second ghost lineage, tangled up somewhere in the settling of the Americas, one that left behind only a faint genetic trace, sitting thousands of miles from wherever its people actually originated, and offering yet more proof that the prehistoric world was far more complicated than anything the old textbooks ever described. The footprints that broke time. The final piece of this puzzle turned up in a desert basin in New Mexico, and it triggered one of the most intense scientific debates in recent memory. In 2021, a team of researchers working at White Sands National Park announced the discovery of a series of fossilized human footprints pressed into the muddy edge of an ancient, long dried-up lake bed. Unlike stone tools, which can sometimes change into older layers of dirt over time through natural processes, footprints do not move once they are set. They represent an exact moment when real people walked across wet mud. And the sizes of these particular tracks suggested they were made mostly by teenagers and children running along the edge of the lake. The original 2021 study dated the footprints somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years old, based on ancient seeds trapped inside the impressions. That number triggered immediate pushback from other researchers. In 2024, a separate study challenged those dates, arguing that the seeds might have absorbed older carbon from the surrounding groundwater, which could make them read thousands of years older than they actually were. Other researchers had already been working to settle the question using completely different methods. An earlier study published in 2023 used fossilized pine pollen and quartz sand grains to sidestep the groundwater problem entirely, and that work strongly supported the original older dates. Further testing in 2025 refined the picture even more, placing the footprints somewhere within a secure range of roughly 17,000 to just over 23,000 years old. Even at the younger end of that range, these footprints remain genuinely groundbreaking. They prove that people were living deep inside North America at the height of the Ice Age, long before any ice-free corridor had opened through Canada, and long before the old Clovis first model said anyone should have been there at all. The simple map with one arrow crossing from Asia into America is gone for good, replaced by a much messier history of lost homelands and ghost populations that scientists are only now beginning to understand, one discovery at a time. We'd like to know your thoughts about this. Could the true story of how people reached the Americas be completely different from anything we believe today? Do you think there are more hidden human lineages still waiting to be found inside old museum collections? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.